Well, welcome. It's a pleasure to sit here and visit with you, Ken. You've obviously had a very distinguished and influential background in thought over the last couple of generations. So it'd be very nice to catch up with you. I think I will start with one concept that seems to be reasonably central to your philosophy,
Okay,
which is, which is the evolution of consciousness.
right.
Now, the idea is not only that consciousness has evolved from, say the days of the paramecium, but it has also evolved in historical times over recent centuries.
Right.
Could you talk about your views on that point?
Sure. Let me say that there's a fairly widespread general school of philosophy in the West called panpsychism. And panpsychism maintains that what we call the psyche or the mind is pan or present everywhere. And that means that atoms have a bit of mental capacity, molecules have a bit of mental capacity, single-celled organisms have a mental capacity, multicellular organisms have a mental capacity, and all the way up the tree of life, from fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, humans. And then when we get to humans, not only are they the highest reach of mental capacity, and actually let me say something about what I mean by mental capacity, because I don't like the term panpsychism. And the reason is that psyche is too complex a term for the type of mind that a proton has, or a neutron has, or an atom has. And I much prefer Alfred North Whitehead's term prehension, because prehension just means touching or feeling, and that touching is the type of mentality that an atom has, because an atom touches other atoms. And those atoms together make up molecules, and molecules touch other molecules. And when a bunch of molecules come together, they form single-celled organisms. And those single-celled organisms touch other single-celled organisms to form multicellular organisms. And those go all the way up the tree of life, from fish to amphibians to reptiles to mammals to humans. And as I was saying, as humans, their mentality also goes through a variety of stages of development. And this was discovered by America's second greatest psychologist named James Mark Baldwin. And America's first greatest psychologist was, of course, William James. And both William James and Mark Baldwin are listed among America's very greatest philosophers. James, of course, for inventing pragmatism, and James Mark Baldwin for his work in a book called Thoughts and Things. And what Baldwin was the first to notice, he actually invented developmental psychology, which is the study of these stages of mental growth, or the stages of prehensive growth that humans went through. Because what he noticed is he took the fairly common Western philosophical tradition of so-called goodness, truth, and beauty. And he measured each of those and found that each of them went through a series of stages of unfolding, or stages of development. And he named those stages things like pre-logical to logical to translogical to integral. And he found that all three of those, to which he added a fourth, which he just called religion, So the good, the true, and the beautiful. The good were the stages of moral development, how we treat each other with goodness and care and concern and morality. And then truth was what he took to mean true as in scientific, objective truth. And then the beautiful, which was beauty that's in the eye of the beholder, or the pronoun I, me, mine. And those were the first three that he studied. And then he added religion because he noticed that religious belief also went through these stages of development that he had discovered in the good, the true, and the beautiful. So that gave us four different lines of development, but each of those four lines of development, the good, the true, the beautiful, and religion, each of those four lines went through the same basic levels of development. And James Mark Baldwin actually discovered around 7 or 8 total levels of development. And all of the different lines went through those same basic levels of development. And that was the beginning of developmental psychology. And that was in the 1940s and 1950s. And by the 1950s, these stages of development had become fairly well known among the psychological community. And there was an outburst of many different models of development. And what the researchers were actually doing, although they didn't realize it at the time, because multiple intelligences were not a very common understanding at that point. But what they were doing is psychologists came to realize that there are around a dozen or so, some have much more, some have much fewer, but there's around a dozen or so multiple intelligences. We have cognitive intelligence, moral intelligence, ego development or ego intelligence, spatial, mathematical, musical, and so on. And each of those had a researcher that singled out unknowingly a particular multiple intelligence, and they were studying the growth of that multiple intelligence. So Maslow chose a needs hierarchy of development. Piaget chose a cognitive line of development. Kohlberg chose a moral line of development, and so on. And we had about a dozen multiple intelligences. And what each major researcher, whether Kohlberg, Piaget, Lovinger, Arrietty, Maslow, what each of them did was they selected a particular moral or cognitive or mathematical intelligence, and they studied the stages of growth that it went through. And everybody went through these stages. So if once they had chosen the line of development that they were going to examine, whether it was Piaget studying cognitive development or Kohlberg studying moral development or Lovinger studying ego development, is they could track these stages because every human being went through all of the stages. And if they continued to grow and develop, they went through all 8 or so major levels of development. Because each of them was dealing with a different line of development, they each gave them different names. Even though they were going to the same basic levels, they each named these levels according to the line it was going through. So Piaget gave cognitive names to his stages. So they were sensorimotor intelligence, pre-operational intelligence, concrete operational intelligence, formal operational intelligence, and systemic or integral intelligence. Kohlberg named them pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional, and systemic, and so on. And these different names, they eventually realized all of them are dealing with the same basic levels. Those different levels of development were all realized to be the same basic levels, but each had a different line going through it. So same levels, different lines. And that became the first full-fledged developmental model of consciousness. Well, each of these levels unfolded at a different time in our actual history. So the earliest, which Gene Gebser called the archaic stage, was our basic transition from the great apes or from chimpanzees. And then that went to so-called pre-operational stage, which was a kind of magic belief because the mind had not yet fully differentiated from that which it was aware of. So if it started to invent symbols and words and an alphabet, it would come up with names like archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral. And those different names reflected the actual stages that human beings went through. So the archaic stage started some 400,000 years ago, because that was as we were transitioning from the great apes and chimpanzees into Homo sapiens. And because the mind had not yet fully differentiated itself from that which it was aware of, so if it wrote the word tree, T-R-E-E, that was called the signifier, and the signified is what came to your mind when you read the signifier or tree. So whenever you read the word tree, you form an image of a real tree in your mind. The actual referent of the signifier, T-R-E-E, is the real tree. Just pick a real tree, and that's what you mean when you spell the word T-R-E-E. But because the mind had not yet fully differentiated the symbol T-R-E-E from the real referent or the real tree, it couldn't distinguish between operating on the signifier and operating on the real tree. So if it changed the signifier or the word tree, they felt that it actually magically changed the real tree. And that was just one of the very earliest pre-differentiated stages of development. It was called magic, because if you changed the signifier, you magically changed the referent, because they weren't clearly differentiated. And then when you move to the mythic stage, human beings learn to differentiate the signifier from the referent, but they didn't get rid of magic. They just themselves could no longer perform magic because they had fully differentiated the signifier from the referent. But what they did is they transferred the capacity of magic to a whole host of heavenly gods, goddesses, divine nature, spirits, and so on. And if we prayed to those heavenly beings with a great deal of sincerity and belief, then we could ask them to perform magic on our behalf. So when this began to happen around 50,000 years or so BCE, then we would often pray for them to make our crops grow. Or in today's world, we'd pray to them to get a new car, get a girlfriend or get a boyfriend or whatever. But if we prayed with a great deal of sincerity, we believed that those gods would perform that magic on our behalf. So they would magically get us the car or get us the new house or get us the pay raise or whatever it was that we wanted them to magically get for us. And that formed the mythic stage of development. And then as we moved into the common era around the time of Christ, we began to be able to think not just in terms of concrete operational thinking, which gave us mythic, but we could move on to, and myth, Piaget defined as thought operating on the real world. And so an example of concrete operational thinking would be, I go in the garage, I get my bike, I pull it down from the wall, I get on it, I put my feet on the pedals, and I start pedaling. And all of those are concrete operational behaviors because they're me concretely operating on the world. I'm pedaling my bike or steering my bike, and those are all concrete items, and my thought is operating on those concrete items, and therefore I'm actually riding my bike or steering my bike or whatever. Those are all concrete operations or thought operating on the concrete world. Then by the time we reach the Western Renaissance and Western Enlightenment, and formal operational cognition started to emerge during the Enlightenment, which was actually called the Age of Reason. And that is when we started using things like logic or mathematics, which is thought operating on thought, not just operating on the concrete world, but operating on our cognitive thinking. So thought operating on thought gave us rationality and logic and mathematics and stuff like that. And that, again, tended to emerge on a historical scale around the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in the modern West. So notice that rationality forms single, universal, holistic systems. So rationality, there isn't Protestant chemistry versus Hindu chemistry versus Buddhist chemistry. There's just chemistry. It's a single unified science, and it applies to everywhere on the planet and to every human being on the planet. So it just forms single unified systems of thinking. And that's what rationality does. And that's what science does. So we have multiple sciences: chemistry, biology, physics, psychology, sociology. And each of those are separate individual items, but they apply to the universal system, the single universal system. There's only one basic chemistry. There's only one basic biology. There's only one basic psychology, and so on. And then the next stage actually starts to notice, well, wait a minute, there are all sorts of different cultures around the world. There's French culture, German culture, Chinese culture, American culture, and so on. And each of those have separate but important truths. And we call that multiculturalism. And when that was discovered, roughly in the 1950s and 1960s, we call that multiculturalism or pluralism, or more commonly, postmodernism, because it came after modernism, which was formed by rationality and which recognized just a single universal system for each individual science. Well, multiculturalism recognized a multiplicity of separate truths, each referring to a different multicultural system. So we just had a plethora of multicultural truths and no way to bring them together. Well, that's what Claire Graves called the monumental leap to second tier involved. And that was when we began to develop the integrated systems of thinking. And by definition, these integral, of which two major substages are now recognized, what they did was they brought together all these multicultural systems. And a multicultural system itself was often called paradigmatic because it would usually unite two or three separate individual sciences into a single unit. So it would create paradigms out of individual systems. So it united biology and chemistry into biochemistry. And this was often called cross-paradigmatic, when they brought together these separate individual multicultural truths. And that's why Claire Graves referred to them as a monumental leap towards integral. And he called this stage monumental because all the previous stages could not unite the various paradigms into cross-paradigmatic unities. And that's what the integral stages did. So we divide those into teal and turquoise, or sometimes called paradigmatic and cross-paradigmatic. And the percent of the population at paradigmatic or teal was about between 5 and 7% of the population reached teal stages, which isn't very much. But the percent that reached turquoise was significantly less. Turquoise was called cross-paradigmatic because it started bringing together all these different paradigms. And the percent of the population that reached cross-paradigmatic thinking was 0.5%. So that's a very small percent of the population actually reached turquoise levels. But it was a real stage of development. It was available to everybody who kept growing up to the cross-paradigmatic stage, the turquoise stage, the 0.5% stage. And that was a very important growth. And it was only reached in the upper echelons of the Enlightenment people. So that gave us a full history of prehension, starting from the lowest, which started with quarks, protons, neutrons, and continued into atoms, continued into molecules, continued into single-celled organisms, continued into multicellular organisms, continued into fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and human beings. And human beings developed through archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral stages of development. So that gave us an entire spectrum of consciousness, entire spectrum of the actual stages of development that our consciousness went through to get us to this turquoise or multi-paradigmatic or cross-paradigmatic stage of development. And that's the story of our historical unfolding of consciousness.
Well, thank you. That's very comprehensive and, of course, insightful. The contrasting perspective, and this is represented by a fair number of thinkers, including like Gurdjieff and René Guénon,
Right.
point that the fact that we may have lost as much as we have gained, that is to say, cognitively. That is to say, for example, Bushman can perceive things that Lawrence Vanderpost couldn't, as he writes in his books. So you would seem to be saying that each of this is a cumulative growth.
Right.
But A lot of thinkers are pointing to the fact, uh, what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world.
Right.
There's at least as much a sense of loss, which may be a cognitive loss as well as kind of an emotional loss. How would you respond to a claim like that?
Well, that is a fundamental confusion that all retro-romantic thinkers make. And the confusion is very easy to understand because when we're first born, the first year or so of life, remember the brain mind has not yet differentiated itself from the referent. So it comes up with all sorts of symbols, all sorts of words, but those words are not yet differentiated from the thing they represent. So the word TREE is not differentiated from a real tree. And so it appears that there's a unity in consciousness. And there is, but it's a pre-rational unity. It's not a fully developed mystical unity. If we use the Christian version of the Great Chain of Being, it goes from matter to body, body meaning real, alive, living organisms, to mind, to soul, to spirit. And when you reach a spirit stage and have a unity experience, it's a unity with all five of those levels. It's a unity with matter, body, mind, soul, and spirit. But that's not the type of unity that a newborn has. A newborn is just one with the material environment, which it has not yet differentiated itself from. Well, that's not a very high type of unity. That's not a unity with matter and body and mind and soul and spirit. But if you have a Zen Buddhist Satori, a mystical experience from the highest level, it is a unity with all five of those stages of development. And if you include models that give 8 stages or even 10 stages of development, it's a unity with all of those stages. Now, when we were first studying the stages of development, and developmentalists were studying that first, earliest, or archaic stage, they naturally found that the infant could not differentiate itself from the material environment. And being sort of materialists at heart, they looked at that as an absolute unity with the entire universe. But it wasn't. It was only one with the lowest level of the entire universe, which is actually a terrifyingly narrow and small type of unity. So it's not a full, complete unity that the retro-romantics all confuse this ultimate unity with the infantile unity. And I myself did this at the very first stage of my own understanding, which is that the archaic stage I felt was a unity with the entire world. But as we grew up and we developed into body, mind, soul, and spirit, we were actually cutting off our unity with the entire universe, where we weren't. We were actually growing from the matter to the body stage, and from the body to the mind stage. And at the mental stage, the ego starts to emerge, and we get a separation of ego, of course, from body and from matter. And as soon as retro-romantics see the emergence of the ego, they say, oh, that's a loss of our profound unity. And they all make that confusion. And that's why I call it retro-romantic, because it's actually a retrogression. It's not some high level of unity. It doesn't even get to soul or spirit. But all retro-romantics, we call them retro-romantics because they have a romantic version. And the romantics theorists all see that earliest stages of unity with the separate self, with the entire material world, they see that as a unity with the entire universe. And it's nothing like that at all. It's a unity with the lowest level of the entire universe, which is nothing to be proud of. So I call it, and I add retro to romantic to remind people that the romantic view is a retrogression. It's a regressive movement. So if you actually become one with just the material level, you've clearly gone backwards from matter, body, mind, soul, or spirit, and you're just identifying with the material level. That's obviously a regression. You've gone back down to the lowest level of the entire universe, which is a simple matter. You're not even at body or mind or soul or spirit. And so that's the people that make kind of statements that you just summarized are all retro-romantic thinkers, because they all think that same mistake. They think, oh, I'm going to go back to the unity I had when I was an infant. Well, no, you're not. That would be horrifying. If you actually regress back to the material level, you wouldn't be one with body, mind, soul, or spirit. What kind of unity is that? That's just a unity with the very lowest level of the material universe. And that's nothing, as I say, to be proud of.
Okay, well, thank you. That's very enlightening. The model you just presented is one of increased unification and integration of consciousness. Right. How do you relate this to the reality of the present day world, where there's an enormous sense of increasing fragmentation and isolation?
Right. Well, as you move up this great chain of being, as you go from matter to body to mind to soul to spirit, or to use Gene Gebser's 6 stages, archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral, at each of those stages, because they are an actual stage of development, something can go wrong. And you can move from matter to body. And when the body level starts to emerge and we begin to identify with our actual feelings and emotions and our separate ego, that is what Gebser called magic, again, because we haven't yet fully differentiated the mind from what it's thinking about, and therefore we think that to change the word or the signifier is to change the actual referent or what the word represents. And that's just not true. It happens in a magical cognition, a magical imagination, but that's magic, that's not real. And then when you move from magic to mental and develop a fully mental, rational stage of development, something can go wrong at that stage. And when that happens, we don't just transcend and include the previous stage, which is what all healthy development transcends and includes the previous stage. And that's true in all 4 quadrants. So even in the upper right quadrant, which goes from atoms to molecules to single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms to fish, reptile, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and humans, and then humans go through their 7 major stages of development. As you're developing mind, you can overdevelop mind, or you can repress the previous stages of development. You don't integrate them, so you don't transcend and include them, you transcend and repress them. And when you do that, you split off the mind from the body and from its material elements. And when you split off the mind from body and matter, then you are creating a repression. You're repressing the lower levels. You're not integrating them. And because of that, we frequently, almost everybody, develops some form of so-called body-mind dissociation. And that's where you split the mind off from the body and its material components, And that's not good. And when that happens, we generally form various forms of depression because we're not in touch with our body and matter, or we form some type of split or dissociation, and we don't differentiate and integrate, we differentiate and repress. And that repression is what you're referring to as an uncomfortable feeling or dissociation, or that. And almost everybody has some degree of repression or dissociation or splitting. And that's why the mind-body problem is called the most difficult problem in Western philosophy. Like, what is the relation of this mind and body? Especially if I'm split off into just my mind and I'm repressing my body. How on earth does that happen? We generally acknowledge that Freud came up with the first significant response to how that happens. And when Freud was asked, what does this psychoanalysis of yours do? He famously said, where id was, there ego shall be. And what most people know terms like id and libido and ego from Freud. And let me preface this by saying, first person perspective is the perspective of the person speaking. So right now I'm first person. Second person is the perspective of the person being spoken to. So right now you're second person. So first person is I, me, mine. Second person is you, thy, thine, so on. And third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So that's a he, she, they, them, it, or its. That becomes our general repertoire of pronouns. What most people don't know is that we actually have fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth person pronouns. So Jane Lovinger, for example, defines each stage of her 7 or 8 stages of development by saying it introduces a higher perspective of pronouns. So her first stage can only understand first person perspective, or I, me, mine. It's a very egocentric or narcissistic stage. Her second stage adds a capacity to understand a second person perspective, or understand that you have a different perspective than I do. So you're a second person and I'm a first person. And then her third stage can understand a third person perspective. So it can understand that you have your perspective, I have my perspective, and they have their perspective, which is he, she, they, them, it, or its. And her fourth person stage can add a fourth person perspective. And if you're thinking about third person and second person and first person, you're thinking about them all together, you're using a fourth person perspective, and so on up the fifth, sixth, seventh to eighth person perspective. So we do have these 8 person perspectives, and they each define, according to Jane Lovinger, a higher stage of development. And if we continue our growth and development, we'll continue that growth through all 8 of these perspectives. And so we're obviously getting very complex in our capacity to think of perspectives, all the way up to an 8th person perspective.
Great. Well, thank you. In your discussion so far, you've alluded more than once to Claire Graves' spiral dynamics,
Right.
Which posits these levels of consciousness in terms of colors. If I remember correctly, beige is the lowest, red is the next, up and up and up. And he's got turquoise, as you point out, at the top, this kind of most integral thing. Consciousness. One thing that intrigued me about at least the book Spiral Dynamics by Beck and his co-author is the speculation of a level beyond turquoise, which they call coral.
Right.
Um, I'm very curious to think what you associate with this coral, where you think it's going to go beyond turquoise.
Right. I refer to that as the psychic level. And basically, what you're doing is as you look at each stage of development, you start to spot things that each higher stage contains. We've already talked about a higher stage containing a bigger perspective. And for me, the turquoise is the 8th major stage of development, and the 9th major stage of development is the psychic stage. And what that means is that it's added a greater perspective, and that means you have a larger identity. Because as you look at each stage of development, as it grows through these 8 major stages, each stage adds a larger self-identity. So you start out just identified with the material aspects of your being. And within the first year or so, you add a second stage or a second person perspective. And when you do that, you identify with all of your emotions and your feelings and so on. And then the third stage, you add a third person perspective. So you expand from identifying with your self and self feelings and emotions to identifying with the mind, matter, body, mind, and mind expands to the full ego self. So you've gotten bigger again. And then as you move beyond the ego, you start to move to the trans-ego stages, including the green or multicultural postmodern stage. And then from there, you move to the integral stages, the paradigmatic and the cross-paradigmatic stages. And each of those involves getting a bigger self, a self that's more inclusive, that can identify with larger perspectives. And each stage does just that. So what goes beyond the 8th stage or the turquoise stage or the first trans-integral stage? And this is indeed the stage that Beck and Cowan call choral, and I call psychic. And they're not very clear about what choral consists of. But for me, the next biggest self you can have, once you're identified with the full range of mental capacities, is you actually go beyond your identity with the self to an identity with the earth, and therefore an identity with the beginning trans-earth identities, which is what I mean by psychic. And that actually includes a oneness with the lower levels of the entire universe. And that's what mystical experiences, for example, begin by identifying with all of the universe. And if they get bigger and go from psychic into subtle, they identify with all of the known universe. And so this is the first stage beyond the earth stage, which is the stage that's beyond the turquoise, is the identification with universal consciousness. And this is a very real mystical experience. It's actually got a name. It's often called cosmic consciousness because it's an identification with the entire cosmos. And that's what I believe is the next stage beyond turquoise. And remember, only 0.5% of the population reaches turquoise. So the percent that reaches beyond turquoise into psychic is even less than 0.5%. And since each higher stage tends to identify with a tenth of the percent of the people that identify with the previous stage. A tenth of 0.5% is not very much. So there aren't a lot of people having that type of cosmic consciousness experience. But the ones that do are all identified as mystics, and they themselves tend to think of themselves in mystical terms.
Thank you. Well, I think I'd like to turn, our time is running out. I don't want to keep you any longer than we promised, but kind of a last question. I'd like to ask you about psychology.
Sure.
A lot of what you say has been connected with a movement called transpersonal psychology.
Right.
And you know many, if not all, of the leading figures in that movement. That there was a time when this seemed to be burgeoning, say from the beginning of humanistic psychology with Maslow in the 60s, maybe into the 90s when psychiatrists started listening to Prozac and really stopped listening to anything else.
Right.
Where would you say the state of transpersonal psychology, these insights, stand in regard to mainstream psychology? Because they would seem a lot more fringe now than they may have done 50 years ago.
Yeah. It's often referred to as fourth force. The first force being psychoanalysis, second force being behaviorism, third force being humanistic existential psychology, and the fourth force being transpersonal. And you can notice that each one of those is going higher on the scale of consciousness. So by the time we get to fourth force or transpersonal, the name sort of gives it away. It's whatever stage is the first beyond the personal stages. So in other words, what they're really talking about when they talk about transpersonal psychology is states of consciousness that include cosmic consciousness and higher. And that's what transpersonal means, is beyond the personal stages of development comes this transpersonal or cosmic consciousness stage. And so it has become friskier over the last 50 years, and it's now tending to become fairly well recognized, although it's still the smallest of the four forces. But it's real, and it is dealing with the smallest percentage of the population, the percentage that has reached cosmic consciousness. And remember, that's a tenth of 0.5%. So that's not a tremendous number.
Right. Okay. Well, certainly has been very comprehensive and certainly been very educational for me. So I really appreciate your taking the time to do this.
Sure. Of course.
It's been a great pleasure and a great honor. So, well, thank you so much.